I found my elderly mother shivering outside my own house while my wife and her sisters threw a party inside like they owned the place. My mother whispered, "Son, why won't they let us in?" What I did next shattered their lives beyond repair. Look, I'm not the kind of guy who believes in cosmic signs or karma or whatever nonsense people post about on their Instagram stories between pictures of overpriced avocado toast. But if the universe was trying to tell me something that night, it was doing a pretty solid job of rubbing my face in it. The rain was coming down in sheets, not the romantic, movie montage kind of rain where someone runs through puddles to confess their undying love, but the angry, vindictive type that soaks through your jacket in about 3 seconds flat and makes you question every life decision that led you to standing outside in it. It was the kind of rain that felt personal, like Mother Nature herself had beef with me specifically and decided tonight was collection day. I'd parked my car 2 blocks down because apparently even finding a spot near my own house had become a competitive sport I wasn't invited to play. As I walked up the street, water squishing in my shoes with every step, I could see my house. Well, the house I thought I owned both emotionally and legally, which turned out to be a distinction that mattered more than I'd realized. The windows were lit up like Times Square on New Year's Eve, and I could hear the bass thumping from the stereo system I'd stupidly installed last year, because Serena said it would be fun for parties. Turns out she was right, just not parties I was apparently invited to or even informed about. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could make out shapes moving around inside. People were dancing, drinks were being waved around with the kind of reckless abandon that suggested nobody was worried about the security deposit, and someone had clearly decided that my living room, the living room where I watched football games in my underwear and fell asleep during documentaries about World War II, was now the hottest nightclub in a 3-block radius. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. But then I saw her, and every sarcastic thought I'd been mentally rehearsing evaporated like spit on a hot sidewalk. There on the front step, hunched over like a question mark that nobody wanted to answer, was my mother, Ruth. Mom. The woman who'd raised me on a diet of instant oatmeal, brutally honest advice, and the occasional insult delivered with such precision it felt like a compliment. She was sitting there in the rain, wearing a coat so thin it might as well have been made of hope and good intentions, her gray hair plastered to her head, hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for a bus that was never going to come. When she heard my footsteps, she looked up, and I swear to God, I felt something crack inside my chest. Her eyes were watery, could have been the rain, could have been tears, probably both. And her voice came out small and fragile, like a bird with a broken wing trying to convince you it could still fly. "Son," she whispered, and the word carried more weight than it had any right to. "Why won't they let us in?" That sentence hit me like a sucker punch to the gut, the kind where you don't realize how much it hurt until you try to breathe and find out your lungs have other ideas. Between the raindrops hammering down around us and the muffled thump of whatever God-awful remix was playing inside, probably something with way too much auto-tune and not enough actual talent, I felt this sharp, ridiculous urge to march inside and hand everyone tiny party hats and a bill for emotional damages. I wanted to be the kind of son who burst through that door like an action hero, kicked everyone out, and delivered some perfectly scripted monologue about respect and decency that would make them all weep with shame. But then I really looked at her eyes. Not just glanced, but looked, and I saw something that made all my planned sarcasm and righteous anger shrivel up like a slug covered in salt. She wasn't just cold or wet or uncomfortable. She was hurt. Deeply, genuinely hurt in that way that goes bone deep and settles in for the long haul. And she was embarrassed, which was somehow worse, because my mother had never been embarrassed about anything in her entire life. This was a woman who'd once told off a police officer for giving her a parking ticket and somehow walked away with an apology. This was a woman who'd raised me as a single parent after Dad died and never once complained or made me feel like I was a burden. And now she was sitting on the front step of what was supposed to be her home, locked out like some kind of inconvenient package that nobody wanted to sign for, while a bunch of people who couldn't pick her out of a lineup if their lives depended on it partied inside with her furniture, her dishes, her space. The rain kept coming down, relentless and cold, turning the world into a blurry watercolor painting where nothing had solid edges anymore. I could hear laughter from inside the house, high-pitched, performative laughter that people only do when they're trying to prove how much fun they're having. Someone screamed, "Yas, Queen," and I made a mental note to find out who was responsible for that particular crime against the English language and have a serious conversation with them about their life choices. I helped Mom to her feet, feeling how her hands trembled in mine, whether from cold or emotion or both. I couldn't tell. She was lighter than I remembered, more fragile, like she'd been slowly disappearing right in front of me, and I'd been too busy, too distracted, too stupidly optimistic to notice. Her coat was soaked through completely, offering about as much protection as a paper towel in a hurricane, and I could see her shivering despite her best efforts to hide it. "Come on, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though I felt like I was juggling grenades with the pins already pulled. "We're not staying here tonight." She looked at me with confusion mixed with relief, like someone who'd been lost for hours and finally saw a familiar landmark. Part of me wanted to storm inside right then and there, flip over tables, throw people out by their overpriced designer collars, and reclaim my space with the kind of dramatic flourish that would have made for great television. But the bigger part of me, the part that still had some connection to rational thought, knew that tonight wasn't about making a scene. Tonight was about getting my mother somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere she wasn't treated like an unwanted piece of furniture that nobody knew quite what to do with. As we walked back to my car, rain soaking us both to the bone, I glanced back at the house one more time. The party was still going strong, nobody inside even aware that we'd been out there, that my mother had been sitting in the cold waiting for basic human decency that never came. The music thumped on, the lights flashed, and the laughter continued, oblivious and careless. And in that moment, walking through the rain with my mother's hand in mine, I made a decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But first, we needed dry clothes, hot tea, and a plan. Because if there's one thing my mother taught me during all those years of instant oatmeal breakfasts and brutally honest life advice, it's that revenge is a dish best served cold, preferably after you've had time to think it through. Document everything, and make sure your ducks are in a row before you flip the table. The rain kept falling as we drove away, and I couldn't help but think that maybe the universe wasn't punishing me after all. Maybe it was just setting the scene for what came next. Let me take you back about 6 months, to a time when I still believed that good intentions could substitute for actual foresight, and that my marriage was built on something sturdier than Pinterest boards and filtered photographs. Dad died on a Tuesday, which felt weirdly appropriate because Tuesdays have always been the most unremarkable, forgettable day of the week. The day where nothing interesting happens except apparently your father's heart deciding it's had enough of this whole living thing and clocking out early. The funeral was your standard issue sad affair with uncomfortable folding chairs, a priest who mispronounced Dad's name 3 times despite having it written down right in front of him, and enough casseroles from well-meaning neighbors to feed a small army or at least keep us constipated for a month. Mom stood there in her black dress that she'd probably owned since the Reagan administration, dry-eyed and stoic, greeting everyone with the kind of grace that made me realize I'd inherited exactly none of her social skills. I was the one crying into my sleeve like a toddler who'd lost his favorite toy, while she shook hands and accepted condolences like she was hosting a particularly somber dinner party. That night, after everyone had finally cleared out and taken their sympathy casseroles with them, I found her sitting in Dad's armchair, the one with the permanent butt groove molded to his exact specifications after 30 years of dedicated sitting. She wasn't crying. She wasn't doing anything, really, just staring at the wall like it might suddenly reveal the secrets of the universe, or at least explain why life had to be so relentlessly unfair. And that's when I made the promise. "Mom," I said, sitting down on the ottoman that Dad always claimed was structurally unsound but never actually threw away because that's not what people of their generation did with perfectly functional furniture. "You're not going to be alone. I promise you that. You're going to move in with us, and we're going to figure this out together, okay?" She looked at me with those eyes that had seen too much. Raising a kid solo after Dad's first heart attack left him unable to work, stretching every dollar until it screamed for mercy. Putting up with my teenage years, which I'm told were particularly unbearable, though I have selectively forgotten most of the details. "You don't have to do that, sweetheart," she said. But I could hear the hope underneath the protest, like a kid pretending they don't want birthday cake, while secretly praying you're going to give them the corner piece with extra frosting. "I want to," I insisted, And here's the kicker. I actually meant it. This wasn't some guilt-driven obligation or performative son-of-the-year nonsense. This was me genuinely believing that bringing my mother into my home would be a good thing, a beautiful merging of family units, a heartwarming solution that would make everyone happy. Man, past me was an optimistic idiot of truly breathtaking proportions. When I brought it up with Serena a few days later, she was in the middle of rearranging our living room for the fourth time that month, because apparently furniture has feelings and needs to experience different views or some interior design philosophy I've never fully understood. She stopped fluffing a throw pillow. We have 7 throw pillows on our couch, and I'm allowed to use exactly 0 of them because they're decorative, and smiled in that way that I've since learned means she's already calculating how this will play on social media. That's so sweet, babe, she said, and I remember feeling relieved because I'd half expected resistance. Your mom is welcome here. It'll be nice having her around. Nice. That word should have been my first warning sign, right up there with fine, whatever, and it's your choice. These are not words that mean what they're supposed to mean in marriage language. These are diplomatic non-answers designed to let you think you've won while actually giving them plausible deniability later. I called her sisters next because Serena has this thing where major decisions require a family conference call, like we're running a small corporation instead of just trying to live our lives. Tanya, who works in marketing and talks like every conversation is a pitch meeting, said it would be fine and that they'd make it work. Brooke, the youngest one who went to art school for 2 years and now considers herself a creative genius despite working at a juice bar, said something about multi-generational households being very European, which I think was supposed to be a compliment, but came out sounding like she was narrating a documentary about exotic cultures. So we did it. We moved Mom in on a Saturday that was way too hot for October, and I remember thinking this was it. This was me being a good son, honoring my father's memory, keeping the family together. I'd rented a U-Haul that was comically oversized for the amount of stuff she actually owned because apparently my mother had been living like a monk who'd taken a vow of minimalism. 1 bedroom set, some kitchen items, about 1,000 books because the woman read like it was an Olympic sport, and her collection of knitted blankets that she'd been making since before I was born. At first, it was actually kind of great. Mom fit into our household like she'd always been there, which makes sense considering she'd literally trained me in the art of existing. She'd wake up early and make actual breakfast, not the grab a protein bar and run situation that Serena and I had normalized, but real food that required pans and effort. She'd sit with Ava, our 8-year-old daughter who I somehow haven't mentioned yet because I'm terrible at linear storytelling, and they'd play these elaborate card games that Mom made up on the spot with rules that changed depending on who was winning. She mended socks. Who mends socks anymore? Apparently my mother. That's who. Because throwing away perfectly good socks just because they have a hole is wasteful, and she didn't raise me to be wasteful even though I absolutely was and continue to be. She'd sit in the corner of the living room with her sewing kit, this ancient tin box covered in flowers that probably predated the moon landing, and patch up clothes that I'd have tossed in the trash without a second thought. For about 3 weeks, I walked around feeling like I'd cracked the code, like I'd figured out how to have it all. Happy wife, happy kid, happy mom, happy life. I was basically a genius at this family thing. I'd catch Serena and Mom chatting in the kitchen and think, yeah, this is working. This is exactly what I wanted. I'd see Ava climbing into Mom's lap to hear stories about when I was a kid, stories that were embarrassing but in that wholesome, isn't family wonderful kind of way, and feel this warm, fuzzy feeling that I assumed was contentment. Turns out that warm, fuzzy feeling was just naivete, keeping me comfortable while the foundation slowly cracked underneath. Because what I'd confused for my family coming together was actually just the calm before the storm, that brief period where everyone's still on their best behavior before the real personalities come out to play. I thought I was being thoughtful and considerate, bringing everyone under one roof. I thought I was honoring my promise to Dad and being the kind of son who actually showed up when it mattered. What I'd actually done was invite my mother into a situation where she'd be slowly, methodically squeezed out by people who smiled to her face and sharpened their knives when she wasn't looking. I'd brought her into a home that I thought was mine, but was really just a stage set for someone else's version of the perfect life. A version that didn't include elderly mothers who mended socks and told outdated jokes and took up space that could have been used for a yoga room, or whatever the hell Serena's sisters thought was more important. But I didn't know any of that yet. I was still operating under the delusion that words like nice and fine meant what they were supposed to mean, that promises mattered, that family was supposed to stick together through the messy parts. I was still the optimistic idiot who thought he'd figured everything out, blissfully unaware that I'd actually just made the biggest mistake of my life. The thing about slow poison is that you don't notice it's killing you until you're already halfway dead. It doesn't announce itself with sirens and flashing lights. It just quietly goes about its business, one microscopic dose at a time, until one day you wake up and realize you can't remember what healthy felt like. That's how the changes started with Mom. So small, so subtle, so easy to write off as nothing that by the time I noticed something was actually wrong, the damage had already set up a permanent residence and started redecorating. It began with dinner, which should have been my first clue because Mom loved dinner. Not in a weird obsessive way, but in that traditional sense where sitting down together as a family was like her religion, the one ritual she refused to compromise on no matter how busy or tired or broke we were when I was growing up. We'd had some truly grim dinners over the years. I'm talking boxed mac and cheese stretched with extra butter to make it look like more, hot dogs cut up and mixed with baked beans because that counted as a complete meal in Mom's Depression-era playbook, but we always sat down together and pretended we were dining at the Ritz. So when she started skipping dinner, I should have recognized it as the red flag it was. But instead, I made excuses. I told myself she was adjusting, that she was tired, that old people eat less anyway, or whatever nonsense I'd half remembered from some article I'd skimmed while waiting for my coffee order. The first time she declined, I was loading the dishwasher, a task that apparently only I was capable of performing in our household despite everyone else having fully functioning hands. When she poked her head into the kitchen and said, "I'm not very hungry tonight, sweetheart. You all go ahead without me." "You sure, Mom?" Serena made her famous chicken thing. Famous was a generous description. Serena's cooking operated on the principle that if you put enough garlic and wine in something, it became sophisticated, regardless of whether it was actually edible. But Mom always ate it with enthusiasm and said nice things, because that's what moms do. They lie about your spouse's cooking to keep the peace. "Just tired," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and then she disappeared upstairs to her room with a cup of tea, which became her signature move over the following weeks. Just tired. Just tired. Just tired. The phrase became a mantra, a get-out-of-family-free card that I accepted without question because I was busy and distracted and apparently blind to the obvious. By week 6, Mom was practically a ghost. She'd emerge from her room in the mornings, moving through the kitchen like she was trying not to disturb the air molecules, making her tea in complete silence. She stopped joining us for breakfast, stopped offering to help with dishes, stopped sitting in the living room to watch her British mystery shows that she loved with an intensity that bordered on concerning. Instead, she'd take her tea and retreat upstairs, closing the door with such careful quietness that it somehow felt louder than if she'd slammed it. "Is Mom okay?" I asked Serena one night after we'd had dinner, another garlic and wine experiment that had turned the chicken into something resembling leather, and Mom had once again excused herself with the same tired refrain. Serena was scrolling through her phone, double-tapping photos of other people's lives with the kind of focus that suggested she was solving world hunger instead of just engaging in mindless social media validation. "She's fine," Serena said without looking up. "She's just adjusting. It's a big change for her." The way she said it, so casual and dismissive, should have bothered me more than it did. But I was in that dangerous zone of wanting to believe everything was fine because the alternative required effort and confrontation, two things I've always been exceptional at avoiding. Then the whispering started, and with it came the realization that I'd been living in a sitcom written by someone with a really dark sense of humor. Serena's sisters had always been around. They treated our house like a community center with better snacks. But suddenly they seemed to be there constantly, huddled together in various corners like they were planning a heist or starting a cult. Tanya and Brooke would show up unannounced, which was already annoying, but then they'd settle in with their expensive coffee drinks that they'd brought from outside because apparently our coffee wasn't good enough, and they'd whisper. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking and they all look at you with those fake smiles that say, "We definitely weren't just talking about you." It was like that, except the person they weren't talking about was my mother. They'd go quiet when she entered a room, or they'd suddenly shift to talking about something aggressively neutral like the weather or reality TV, or whether almond milk was better than oat milk, which is a debate I genuinely believe was invented to make people feel like they have opinions about something that matters when they really don't. The opinions started creeping out in small doses. Tanya mentioned that Mom's cardigan was very vintage, in a tone that suggested vintage was not a compliment, but rather a polite synonym for should have been thrown away in 1987. Brooke made a comment about how Mom folded the dish towels differently and demonstrated the correct way to fold them, which apparently involved more corners and some kind of rolling technique that seemed designed more to assert dominance than to actually improve towel storage. They'd laugh at Mom's jokes, but it was that kind of laughter that's really just performed politeness. Too loud, too long, stopping abruptly like someone had flipped a switch. Then they'd clap, actually clap, when she stopped talking, like she'd just finished some kind of performance that they were relieved had ended. Mom would smile and excuse herself, and I'd sit there feeling something twist in my gut, but not quite having the language or the courage to call it out. The worst part was watching how Mom changed under this constant low-level scrutiny. She started second-guessing herself, apologizing for things that didn't require apologies. Sorry, is this where the mugs go? I can never remember. She'd lived with us for 2 months at that point. She knew where the mugs went. But she'd ask anyway, her voice small and uncertain, looking for permission to exist in a space that was supposed to be her home. She stopped telling her stories, the ones about growing up in Pennsylvania coal country, about her own mother who could stretch $1 so far it could circumvent the globe, about the time she accidentally set the kitchen curtains on fire trying to impress a boy by cooking him dinner. These stories had become Ava's favorites, little windows into a world that seemed simultaneously foreign and familiar, but Mom just stopped sharing them. When Ava would ask, "Grandma, tell me about when you were little," Mom would deflect with, "Oh, that's boring, sweetheart. Why don't you tell me about your day instead?" I should have said something. Every fiber of my being that wasn't completely absorbed in work deadlines and pretending my marriage was fine knew I should have said something. I should have pulled Serena aside and asked what the hell was going on. I should have told her sisters to back off, that this was Mom's home too, that respect wasn't optional. I should have sat Mom down and asked her point blank why she was hiding in her room like a prisoner instead of living like a person. But I didn't. Instead, I kept telling myself that they'd come around, that this was just an adjustment period, that everything would settle down once everyone got used to the new normal. I was a brave idiot, emphasis on the idiot part, convincing myself that ignoring a problem was the same as solving it. I'd perfected the art of looking directly at something terrible and deciding it was actually fine. Just fine, totally fine, nothing to worry about here, folks. The man who keeps telling himself that things will get better without actually doing anything to make them better is either incredibly brave or spectacularly stupid. Spoiler alert, I was definitely the latter, marinating in my own denial while my mother slowly disappeared right in front of me, one skipped dinner and one quiet retreat at a time. There are moments in life that function like a slap to the face, sudden, sharp, impossible to ignore. And then there are moments that work more like carbon monoxide poisoning, quietly filling up the room until you realize you can't breathe, and by then it's almost too late to save yourself. The night I heard them was both, which is a particularly special kind of awful that I wouldn't recommend to anyone, not even people I actively dislike. I'd left work early, which was already a minor miracle considering my boss, Derek, operated under the delusion that leaving before 7 p.m. meant you weren't committed to the company vision, or whatever corporate buzzword nonsense he'd picked up from his latest leadership podcast. But I'd wrapped up a presentation that had been hanging over my head like a sword made entirely of spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides, and I figured I'd earn the right to go home at a reasonable hour like a normal human being instead of a corporate zombie. The house was lit up when I pulled into the driveway, warm yellow lights spilling out of the windows in a way that should have looked welcoming, but instead gave me this weird feeling in my stomach, like when you're about to bite into what you think is a chocolate chip cookie, but turns out to be raisin. All the cars were there. Serena's white SUV that was way too big for someone who only drove to yoga class and the organic grocery store. Tanya's least special luxury sedan that she definitely couldn't afford, but leased anyway, because appearances matter more than financial stability. And Brooks beat up Honda that she'd covered in bumper stickers about saving the environment while simultaneously idling in drive-thrus for 20 minutes at a time. I sat in my car for a minute, listening to the end of a podcast about true crime because apparently I needed more darkness in my life, and watched the shadows move across the windows. Someone walked past the living room, then someone else, and I could see the flicker of what looked like candles, which meant Serena was in one of her moods where she decided our house needed ambience despite having perfectly functional electric lighting that didn't threaten to burn the place down. When I got out and walked up to the door, I could hear voices. Not loud, not shouting, but that particular frequency of conversation that people use when they think they're alone and don't need to perform civility for an audience. The front door was slightly ajar, which was weird because Serena was obsessive about locking doors, something about crime statistics she'd read on some mom blog that had convinced her we were living in a war zone instead of a quiet suburban neighborhood where the most exciting thing that happened was Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in a tree. I should have just walked in. It was my house, my door, my right to enter without skulking around like some kind of burglar. But something made me pause with my hand on the doorknob, some instinct that whispered this was one of those moments where you needed to pay attention because you weren't going to get a replay. So I stood there in my own doorway like an idiot, listening. She's taking up space. That was Brooke's voice, unmistakable with that slight vocal fry she developed after watching too many YouTube influencers. She said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather or discussing which brand of almond milk was superior. Like, I get that she's his mom and whatever, but it's awkward having her around all the time. My hand froze on the doorknob. The metal suddenly felt cold, or maybe my hand had just gone numb. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that my body had apparently decided to stop working while my brain went into overdrive trying to process what I'd just heard. It's totally awkward. That was Tanya now, her marketing executive voice clipping the words short and efficient like she was presenting quarterly earnings. Old people ruin the vibe. Like, we can't even have normal conversations anymore because we have to watch what we say. And the way she just sits there sometimes, staring, it's creepy. Plus, this house isn't that big. We need the space for when you guys have people over. She said we. Like this was her house too. Like she paid the mortgage or mowed the lawn or fixed the leaky faucet in the downstairs bathroom that I'd been meaning to deal with for 3 months. Like she had any right whatsoever to have opinions about who lived in my house and who didn't. There was a pause, the kind of silence that feels heavy and full of meaning, and then I heard the sound of a door clicking shut somewhere inside. Soft, careful, deliberate. And then Mom's voice, so quiet I almost missed it under the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. We shouldn't be here. She said we, and I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that she was talking to herself, or maybe to Dad's memory, or maybe just to the universe in general. We shouldn't be here. Not, I shouldn't be here. Like she was still trying to include me in her exile. Still trying to protect me even as she was being slowly crushed under the weight of other people's casual cruelty. I stood there at my own front door, rain starting to drizzle down the back of my neck because of course it was raining again, the universe apparently having decided that every terrible moment in my life needed appropriate weather to match. My pulse was doing this weird drum roll thing, like my heart was trying to break out of my chest and go solve this problem independently since my brain didn't seem to be functioning properly. The smart thing would have been to storm in right then and there. The satisfying thing would have been to kick open the door. Okay, maybe not kick because that would have hurt and possibly broken the door, but open it dramatically at least, and demand to know what the hell they thought they were doing discussing my mother like she was an inconvenient piece of furniture they were trying to get rid of. The brave thing would have been immediate confrontation, righteous anger, a speech about respect and decency that would have made them all ashamed of themselves. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I stood there in the rain and felt something cold settle over me. Something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite hurt, but was maybe some toxic combination of both mixed with a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. It was like someone had suddenly wiped my glasses clean after I'd been walking around looking at the world through a smudged, blurry lens, and now I could see everything with perfect, terrible focus. I didn't storm in. I didn't yell. I didn't throw plates, though the thought crossed my mind and lingered there for a moment like a pleasant daydream. Instead, I backed away from the door, walked back to my car with water squishing in my shoes, and sat there in the dark with the engine off and the rain drumming on the roof. And that's when I started planning. Not the hot, emotional kind of planning where you make rash decisions you'll regret later, but the cold, methodical kind where you think through every angle and every consequence. The kind of planning that requires patience and precision and a willingness to play the long game, even when every fiber of your being wants immediate satisfaction. I sat there and smiled, which probably would have looked unhinged to anyone watching. But there was nobody watching because everyone who mattered was inside my house talking about my mother like she was a problem to be solved. I smiled because I just realized something important. I didn't need to fight back with volume or drama or immediate confrontation. I needed to fight back with something much more effective. I needed to fight back with paperwork, with legality, with the boring, adult machinery of property law and financial documentation. I needed to build a case so airtight that when I finally did make my move, there would be no arguing, no negotiating, no room for them to wiggle out of the consequences of their own cruelty. So I started making a mental list, right there in my car with rain obscuring the windows and my mother's voice echoing in my head. Documents I'd need to gather, conversations I'd need to record, evidence I'd need to collect. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment of casual cruelty carefully documented and preserved like specimens in a lab. The rain kept falling, turning the world outside into a watercolor blur, and I sat there laying mental bricks one by one. Methodical, silent, very adult. The kind of adult who'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't served hot or cold, but with proper legal documentation and a timeline that gives your enemies just enough rope to hang themselves. I pulled out my phone and started taking notes, my fingers moving across the screen with newfound purpose. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about justice. This was about making sure my mother never had to whisper, "We shouldn't be here," ever again. Becoming a ghost in your own home is easier than you'd think. It doesn't require any special skills or supernatural abilities, just a willingness to smile when you want to scream and the ability to nod along to conversations that make you want to flip tables like Jesus in the temple, except with less religious justification and more personal vendetta. I became very good at being a ghost, which is either a useful life skill or a sign that I needed therapy, possibly both. The morning after I'd stood outside my own front door like some kind of rain-soaked stalker listening to my mother being discussed like a pest control problem, I walked into the kitchen and acted like absolutely nothing had changed. Serena was making her green smoothie, a concoction that looked like something you'd drain out of a swamp and tasted worse. And Tanya was already there at 7 in the morning because apparently she'd decided our house was now her house and boundaries were just suggestions for other people. "Morning," I said, pouring myself coffee that I'd learned to make extra strong because I needed the caffeine to fuel my performance as normal husband who hasn't heard anything suspicious. "Sleep well." "Like a baby," Serena said, which was a weird expression considering babies actually sleep terribly and wake up screaming every few hours. But I learned not to point out these logical inconsistencies because that apparently made me difficult. She kissed my cheek, leaving a weird sticky residue that might have been coconut oil or some other product from her extensive collection of things that promised to make her look younger, but mostly just made her smell like a tropical vacation gone wrong. "You're in a good mood," Tanya observed, eyeing me over her own coffee mug, one of my good mugs that I'd specifically bought for myself and that she'd apparently claimed through some kind of squatter's rights. She was wearing athleisure, which is what we call pajamas now when we want to pretend we're about to work out, even though everyone knows we're just going to wear them to brunch and call it a lifestyle choice. "Why wouldn't I be?" I said, smiling in a way that I hoped looked natural and not at all like someone who was internally screaming. "It's a beautiful day. I've got great coffee. I'm surrounded by family." I let that last word hang in the air for just a second, watching to see if either of them flinched. They didn't. Either they were better actors than I'd given them credit for, or they genuinely didn't see the irony in me talking about family, while they actively plotted to push out the woman who'd actually raised me. From that moment on, I became the most agreeable version of myself that had ever existed. When Brooke showed up later that day with ideas about how we should refresh the living room by getting rid of Mom's chair, the one she sat in to read because the light was good and the cushion had molded to her after months of use, I nodded thoughtfully and said, Interesting idea. Let me think about it. When Serena suggested we needed the spare room for a home gym because she'd seen one on Instagram, and suddenly our lives were incomplete without a Peloton we'd never use, I said, maybe. We should discuss budgets. I became a master of non-committal responses, of phrases that sounded like agreement but actually meant nothing. That's worth considering. I can see your point. Let's circle back to that. Corporate speak became my shield, boring everyone into thinking I was on board while actually committing to absolutely nothing. It was like watching myself perform in a play where I was the only one who knew the real plot. But while I was busy being ghost husband during the day, I was working on something else at night. After everyone went to bed, after Serena finished her elaborate skincare routine that involved approximately 17 products and took longer than most Broadway shows, I'd wait until I heard her breathing even out into sleep, and then I'd get to work. The recorder was my first purchase, bought from some electronics store downtown, where the guy behind the counter asked zero questions about why I needed a device that could record audio for 8 hours straight. I hid it inside the ceramic base of the living room lamp, the one that Serena's interior designer friend had insisted we buy even though it cost more than my first car and provided approximately the same amount of light as a depressed firefly. The camera was trickier. I found it online, marketed to concerned parents who wanted to spy on their nannies, which felt grimly appropriate considering I was basically spying on the people who were supposed to be my family. It was disguised as a ceramic owl, because apparently I was creating a whole ecosystem of deceptive home decor, and I placed it on the bookshelf with a clear view of the main living area. Nobody even noticed. Serena walked past it 6 times a day and never once questioned why we suddenly had an owl statue when neither of us had ever expressed any interest in owl-based decorative items. Every evening, after playing the role of agreeable husband, I'd download the footage and audio files to a cloud storage account that I'd set up specifically for this purpose. I'd sit in my car during lunch breaks, or in the bathroom at work like some kind of corporate spy, and listen to recordings of my own house. It was surreal and depressing and absolutely necessary. The things I heard would have been funny if they weren't so casually cruel. Brooke making fun of the way Mom pronounced certain words, doing an exaggerated impression that made Tanya laugh so hard she snorted. Serena sighing loudly every time Mom entered a room, like the mere presence of another human being in the house she didn't pay for was some kind of unbearable inconvenience. Tanya talking about how much better the house would look without old people furniture cluttering up the aesthetic. But the worst was the shoving. I thought I'd imagined it the first time I saw it on the footage. Brooke brushing past Mom in the hallway with just a little too much force, sending her stumbling slightly into the wall. But then it happened again. And again. These tiny, casual acts of physical aggression disguised as accidents, as just being in a hurry, as oops sorry didn't see there. I watched the footage on my phone during a meeting about quarterly projections, and I had to mute myself because I couldn't trust my voice to stay steady. My hands shook slightly as I saved the file, labeled it with a date and timestamp, added it to the growing folder of evidence that was becoming my entire emotional life. At the same time, I started handling the boring grown-up stuff that most people avoid until it becomes a crisis. I made appointments with lawyers, not the family lawyer that Serena knew about, but a different one, someone who specialized in property law and trusts and protecting assets from people who thought they were entitled to things that weren't theirs. His name was Richard, and he had the kind of calm, methodical demeanor that I aspired to, like he'd seen every terrible thing humans could do to each other and was completely unsurprised by all of it. "You want to refinance?" he asked during our first meeting, looking at me over his reading glasses that he probably didn't need, but wore anyway because they made him look more lawyer-like. "Among other things," I said, and then I laid out my situation like I was describing someone else's life, keeping my voice steady and professional even though inside I felt like I was made of rage and sadness held together with duct tape and spite. Richard nodded, took notes, and didn't judge, which was refreshing considering I was basically asking him to help me legally evict my wife and her entire family from the house they thought they owned. We talked about trusts and beneficiaries and title transfers, all the boring paperwork that makes people's eyes glaze over, but that actually determines who gets what when the dust settles. I changed beneficiaries on my life insurance, which felt dramatic but also necessary. I set up a trust for Mom that would protect her even if something happened to me. I transferred titles quietly, signing papers in Richard's office during my lunch breaks, moving assets around like a magician sliding cards across a table, noticeable only when it was too late to change the trick. Serena thought I was having an affair, which was almost funny. She'd make little comments about how I was working late a lot, how I seemed distracted, how I was always on my phone. "Is everything okay?" she'd ask with that particular tone that meant she'd already decided everything was not okay and was just waiting for me to confirm it. "Just busy at work," I'd say, which wasn't technically a lie. I was busy, just not with the kind of work she thought. And every time she looked at me with suspicion, every time she made a passive-aggressive comment about my schedule, I'd smile and think about the folder on my cloud storage that was growing bigger every day. "You're being paranoid," Serena said one night when I suggested maybe her sisters didn't need to be at our house quite so often. She laughed, actually laughed, like the idea that I might have legitimate concerns was hilarious. "They're family. They're welcome here anytime. Right?" I said, nodding like I agreed. Family. And I filed that conversation away too, added it to my mental list of things that would be relevant later, in the after times, when this whole performance was over and the real show could begin. I called my preparation adult stuff, when I needed to think of it as something other than what it actually was: revenge. Cold, calculated, meticulously documented revenge that would be served with proper legal paperwork and a side of "get the hell out of my house." Because at the end of the day, that's what this was about. Not hurting them. Though I wouldn't lie and say the thought didn't bring me some satisfaction, but protecting Mom. Making sure she had a safe place to exist without being pushed, mocked, or made to feel like her presence was an inconvenience to people who had no right to judge her. The party announcement came via text message, which should have been my first warning that I was about to witness a masterclass in audacity. I was sitting in a meeting about supply chain logistics, the kind of meeting where people use words like synergy and optimization while secretly planning what they're going to eat for lunch, when my phone buzzed with a message from Serena. "Having a few people over tonight. Small gathering. Don't worry about it. Already handled everything." The exclamation points were doing a lot of heavy lifting in that message, trying to make it sound casual and fun when what it actually meant was, "I'm throwing a party at your house without consulting you, and you're going to smile about it." The "don't worry about it" was particularly galling, as if my main concern about surprise parties in my own home was whether or not I'd have to contribute to the planning rather than, the basic concept of being consulted about events happening in the space I paid for. I texted back a thumbs up emoji because I'd learned that emojis were a great way to communicate absolutely nothing while seeming engaged, and then I spent the rest of the meeting calculating how much this small gathering was going to cost me. Serena's idea of small was like a rich person's idea of a starter home. Technically accurate, but wildly disconnected from normal human reality. When I got home that evening, earlier than usual because I had a bad feeling about this whole situation, I discovered I'd vastly underestimated the situation. The house looked like someone had decided to throw a wedding reception without the benefit of actual marriage or planning permission. There were catering vans in my driveway, actual vans plural, and people were carrying in trays of food that probably cost more per ounce than gold. Someone had installed what appeared to be a floral wall in my living room, an entire wall made of flowers, which seemed both excessive and like a fire hazard, though I wasn't sure which concerned me more. The playlist was already going, some kind of curated Spotify nonsense that was trying very hard to be sophisticated but mostly sounded like elevator music had a baby with a department store and they'd raised it on pretension. I could hear Serena's laugh from somewhere inside, that particular high-pitched performance laugh she did when she was trying to impress people, the one that sounded like someone had told her laughing was supposed to happen but hadn't explained how to do it naturally. Surprise! Tanya appeared in the doorway wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment and holding a glass of wine that I definitely hadn't bought. "Isn't this great?" Serena really outdid herself. "With my credit card, I assume," I said, keeping my voice light even though I wanted to ask approximately 17 questions starting with "Who authorized this?" and ending with "Are you all completely insane?" But I was ghost husband now, the agreeable phantom who nodded and smiled while internally documenting everything for future legal proceedings. "Oh, don't be boring," she said, waving her hand dismissively like my concern about finances was some kind of personality flaw rather than basic adult responsibility. "You only live once." Besides, Serena deserves nice things. She works so hard. I almost asked what exactly Serena worked hard at, considering she hadn't had a job since we got married, and her primary activities seemed to involve rearranging furniture and having opinions about throw pillows. But I swallowed the comment because I was saving my energy for bigger battles. This was just a skirmish. The war was coming later, and I needed to keep my powder dry, which is a saying I'd learned from Dad and never fully understood, but which seemed appropriate for my current situation of strategic patience. That's when I saw Mom's taxi pull up. I hadn't even known she'd left the house, which should have concerned me more than it did, but I'd been so focused on playing my role that I'd stopped tracking her movements like I should have been. The taxi, one of those beat-up sedans that smelled like air freshener fighting a losing battle against decades of passengers, pulled up to the curb, and Mom got out slowly, carefully, like someone who wasn't entirely sure they were welcome in their own home. She stood at the gate, and I watched through the window as she took in the scene. The lights, the noise, the obvious celebration happening inside. She was wearing her good coat, the one she saved for church and doctor's appointments. The one that was still somehow too thin for the weather because she'd bought it on clearance 20 years ago and refused to replace it as long as it still functioned. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she was shivering despite her best efforts to hide it. Through the window, I could see Serena and her sisters inside, practicing their toasts on my couch like they were rehearsing for opening night of a play nobody had asked to see. Brooke was holding a champagne glass, champagne I definitely hadn't purchased, and saying something that made Tanya throw her head back in exaggerated laughter. They were completely oblivious to the woman standing outside in the cold, the woman whose home this was supposed to be, the woman who was quite literally being kept out in the cold while they celebrated whatever the hell they thought they were celebrating. The audacity was so profound it should have been classified as a natural resource. The sheer nerve required to throw a party in someone's house, while simultaneously excluding the person who actually had more right to be there than anyone else, was Olympic-level entitlement. If they bottled this kind of audacity and sold it, they could solve the national debt. They could probably solve world hunger. They could definitely power a small city for a year. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds, watching Mom try to make herself smaller, watching her pull her thin coat tighter like that would somehow make her less cold or less unwelcome, and something in me just snapped. Not the hot, angry kind of snapping where you do something stupid and regrettable, but the cold, clear kind where you suddenly see the situation for exactly what it is, and you know precisely what needs to happen next. I walked past Tanya without saying a word, past the catering staff who were setting up a champagne tower, in my living room, on a Tuesday, and out the front door. Mom looked up when she heard the door open, and her face did this complicated thing where relief and shame and love all competed for dominance. She looked at me like someone asking a favor they were too proud to beg for, like someone who'd been taught their whole life not to be a burden and was now living proof that she'd learned that lesson too well. "Mom," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "You're not staying here tonight." Her face fell, and I realized how that sounded, like I was joining the exile, like I was one more person telling her she wasn't wanted. So I quickly added, "You're staying somewhere better. Somewhere you'll actually be treated like a human being instead of an inconvenience." I led her to my car, which I'd parked 2 streets away specifically to avoid the circus in my driveway, and helped her into the passenger seat. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone who'd been folded up too long and was still remembering how to unfold. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "The Kingsley," I said, naming the one nice hotel in our town, the one where people stayed for anniversaries and special occasions, the one with the fancy lobby and the restaurant that had cloth napkins. They have a proper tea service. Real tea, not that herbal nonsense. And significantly less condescension than what you'd find back there. She smiled then, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile like something that had been broken and was just starting to remember how to be whole again. "That sounds lovely, sweetheart. But you should go back to your party." "It's not my party," I said, starting the car and pulling away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, I could see my house lit up like a beacon, hear the faint thump of bass from the ridiculous sound system, see shadows of people moving behind the windows like they belonged there more than we did. "It's definitely not my party." We drove in comfortable silence, The kind of silence that happens between people who've known each other long enough that every moment doesn't need to be filled with conversation. Mom kept stealing glances at me like she wasn't entirely sure this was really happening, like she was waiting for me to turn the car around and tell her this was a mistake. When we pulled up to the Kingsley, the doorman actually opened the car door for her, a real doorman in an actual uniform, treating my mother like she was someone who mattered instead of someone who needed to make herself invisible. I checked her into a suite, not a room but a suite, because if I was going to rack up credit card debt it might as well be for something worthwhile, instead of champagne towers and floral walls. "This is too much," Mom protested as we walked through the lobby with its marble floors and its chandelier that probably cost more than most people's cars. But she was smiling, really smiling, and her shoulders had straightened slightly like she was remembering how to take up space again. "It's not enough," I said, and I meant it. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent. But tonight, you're going to have room service and decent tea and a bed that doesn't come with a side of passive-aggressive comments." I got her settled in the suite, made sure she knew how to work the TV remote, which was unnecessarily complicated because apparently even hotel remotes have gotten too sophisticated for their own good, and showed her the tea service menu which was extensive enough to qualify as light reading. The hotel room I'd booked for myself was 3 doors down from Mom's suite, which felt both close enough to be responsible and far enough away to give her privacy, a concept that had apparently been extinct in my house for the past several months. It was a basic room, nothing fancy, no chandelier or marble bathroom like Mom's suite. But it had a bed, a desk, and most importantly, a door that locked and kept out people I didn't want to deal with, which at this point was approximately everyone except my mother and possibly Ava, though even that was complicated. I barely slept, which wasn't surprising considering my brain had decided this was the perfect time to process every terrible decision I'd made over the past 6 months, while simultaneously planning the most elaborate interpersonal demolition project of my life. Sleep is for people who aren't mentally cataloging evidence and rehearsing conversations that would probably sound way better in their heads than they would in actual reality. I brought my laptop, and I spent most of the night organizing files like some kind of obsessed librarian preparing for the most important presentation of their career. I had folders within folders, each one labeled with dates and times and brief descriptions that sounded clinical and detached, because that's how you had to approach this stuff if you wanted to maintain any semblance of sanity. Audio_11_15_kitchen_comments. Video_11_22_ hallway_incident. Text_messages_various_dates. It was like creating a museum exhibit titled The Slow Erosion of Human Decency, a multimedia experience. I polished transcripts until my eyes burned, reading the same cruel comments over and over until they stopped feeling like words and started feeling like evidence, which was exactly what they were. I labeled files with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that I usually reserve for work presentations, except this time the stakes were significantly higher than quarterly sales figures or customer retention rates. Every time I wanted to close the laptop and just try to sleep like a normal person, I'd remember Mom sitting on that front step in the rain, or standing at the gate tonight shivering in her thin coat, and my hands would go right back to the keyboard. Fury was keeping me awake, but it was a quiet fury, the kind that doesn't explode outward but instead burns steadily like a pilot light, just waiting for the right moment to ignite everything around it. Around 3 in the morning, I started rehearsing lines in my head, trying out different ways to say what needed to be said. Some versions were too aggressive. I didn't want to come across as unhinged, even though I felt pretty unhinged at the moment. Some were too passive. I wasn't about to apologize my way through a confrontation that I'd been planning for weeks. I needed something that landed right in the middle, firm but calm, clear but not cruel, devastating but somehow still civilized. "You have 30 minutes to leave" felt too dramatic, like I was channeling some kind of action movie villain. "I think it's time we discuss some changes" felt too weak, like I was asking permission instead of stating facts. "This is my house, and you need to go" was accurate, but lacked the kind of procedural weight I was going for. I kept workshopping phrases like some kind of deranged screenwriter, trying to find the perfect combination of words that would convey both legal authority and personal disappointment. I kept a running joke in my head. which probably said something concerning about my mental state. You can't evict people from your heart, but you can definitely evict them from your house with proper documentation and a good lawyer. It made me smile briefly in the dark hotel room, which felt like a small victory. Revenge shouldn't be joyless, I decided. It should have at least a little bit of satisfaction mixed in, like adding salt to a recipe, enough to enhance the flavor without overwhelming everything else. Around 4:30, when the sky was just starting to think about maybe considering the possibility of getting lighter, I gave up on sleep entirely and ordered room service. Coffee, mostly, because I was going to need approximately all the caffeine that had ever existed to get through what was coming. The guy who delivered it looked exhausted, which made two of us, and I tipped him extra because we were both awake at an ungodly hour, and that created a kind of solidarity. The coffee was actually good, which surprised me. Hotel coffee usually tasted like someone had passed hot water through a dirty sock, but this was smooth and dark and strong enough to strip paint, which was exactly what I needed. I sat at the small desk and stared at my laptop screen, at the folders full of evidence, at the careful documentation of cruelty disguised as family. Morning light arrived slowly, creeping through the curtains like it wasn't entirely sure it was welcome, accompanied by the smell of someone else's breakfast tray rolling past in the hallway. Bacon, if I wasn't mistaken, which made my stomach remind me that I'd forgotten to eat dinner last night in all the chaos. But I ignored it because I had more important things to focus on, like calling my lawyer and setting into motion the series of events that would finally end this nightmare. I pulled up Naomi's number in my phone. I'd saved her as property attorney instead of her name in case anyone ever looked, which was probably paranoid, but seemed reasonable given my current circumstances. She told me to call any time I was ready to move forward, that she'd make herself available regardless of the hour, which was either dedication to her craft or a sign that she really needed the billable hours. Either way, I appreciated it. I stared at the number for a solid minute, my thumb hovering over the call button. This was it, the point of no return, the moment where I stopped being ghost husband and started being actual person with boundaries and legal representation. Once I made this call, there was no taking it back, no pretending everything was fine, no more playing along with the fiction that this was a family instead of a hostile takeover disguised as domestic life. My hand was steadier than I expected when I finally pressed call. The phone rang twice before Naomi picked up, her voice alert despite it being barely 6 in the morning. Lawyers were apparently a different breed of human, capable of full consciousness at hours when normal people were still negotiating with their alarm clocks. "It's time," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I felt, which was good because I was going for collected and strategic rather than unhinged and emotional. "I'm ready to move forward with everything we discussed." "You're sure?" she asked, not because she doubted me, but because good lawyers always confirm before launching nuclear options. "Once we start this process, it's going to move quickly. There's no pause button." "I'm sure," I said, and I was. I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. They threw a party last night. In my house. While my mother stood outside in the cold because they wouldn't let her in. So yeah, I'm extremely sure. There was a pause, and I could hear her typing in the background, probably pulling up files or making notes or whatever lawyers did at 6 in the morning when their clients finally snapped. "Okay," she said, and her voice had shifted into business mode, efficient and focused. "I'll draw up the final paperwork today. We can move as early as this evening if you want. I assume you have copies of everything we discussed." "Everything," I confirmed, glancing at my laptop where months of documentation sat organized and ready. Audio, video, text messages, financial records, all of it. Time-stamped, backed up in 3 different locations, probably more evidence than we actually need, but I wasn't taking any chances. "Good," Naomi said, and I could hear the approval in her voice. "Meet me at my office at 4. We'll go over everything one final time, make sure all the paperwork is in order, and then we'll pay them a visit. I'll bring Jerry. He's my paralegal, former Marine. Looks intimidating, which helps in these situations, even though he's actually a sweetheart. Sometimes visual presence matters as much as legal documentation." We talked logistics for another 10 minutes. Who would say what order things would happen in, what the likely reactions would be, and how to handle them. Naomi had done this kind of thing before, apparently, which was both reassuring and depressing. Reassuring because it meant she knew what she was doing, depressing because it meant this situation was common enough that there was an actual protocol for it. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet hotel room and felt something shift inside me. The anger was still there. It wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, but it was organized now, purposeful, directed at a specific goal rather than just floating around making me miserable. I was done being the nice guy who let people walk all over him in the name of keeping the peace. I was done pretending that silence was the same as strength, that tolerance was the same as wisdom. I opened my laptop one more time and did a final review of everything. Every file, every folder, every piece of evidence I'd collected over the past weeks. It was all there, a comprehensive record of exactly how badly people could behave when they thought nobody was paying attention. This wasn't just about getting revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. This was about flipping the board, changing the game entirely, making it clear that actions had consequences even when you thought you were untouchable. Walking into my own living room at 9:30 in the morning felt like entering a crime scene. Except the crime was against basic decency, and the perpetrators were still lounging around like they owned the place. The party debris was everywhere, champagne glasses on every surface, plates with half-eaten appetizers that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. That ridiculous floral wall, now looking wilted and sad like it regretted its life choices. The whole scene had the distinct aroma of expensive mistakes mixed with the kind of entitlement that should require a permit. Serena was on the couch, my couch, technically, though that was about to become a very relevant distinction, wearing what I'd learned to recognize as her morning after hosting look, which meant designer loungewear that cost more than most people's rent and the kind of perfectly messy hair that took 45 minutes to achieve. She was scrolling through her phone, probably looking at photos from last night's party to post on Instagram with some caption about being blessed or living her best life or whatever aspirational nonsense was trending this week. She looked up when I walked in, and her face did this complicated thing where surprise mixed with irritation mixed with a hint of guilt, though the guilt disappeared pretty quickly. "You're home early," she said, like I was the one who'd done something wrong by showing up at my own house during reasonable hours. "Where were you?" "I called like 6 times. "Out," I said, setting my keys on the table with deliberate casualness. Like this was any normal morning and not the beginning of the most dramatic conversation of my marriage. "Needed some air. Clear my head. You know how it is." Tanya emerged from the kitchen holding a mimosa. A mimosa at 9:30 in the morning, which suggested that either the party was still technically continuing or she had a drinking problem, possibly both. She was wearing one of those athleisure sets that cost approximately 1 month's worth of groceries, and somehow managed to look both expensive and like pajamas at the same time. The party was amazing, she announced to nobody in particular, like she was narrating a documentary about her own life. "We were just saying what a great time everyone had. You should have stayed." The casual dismissal in her voice, the implication that I was somehow deficient for not enjoying a surprise party thrown in my own house without my permission, was so perfectly Tanya that I almost admired it. "I'm sure it was great," I said, and I let just enough edge creep into my voice that she looked at me a little more carefully, like she was finally starting to suspect that something might be off. "Where's Brooke?" "Upstairs in the guest room," Serena said, emphasizing guest room slightly, which was her passive-aggressive way of reminding me that Mom's room had been redesignated without my input. "She crashed here last night. Too much champagne." She said it fondly, like being too drunk to drive home was a charming personality quirk rather than a sign of poor judgment and possibly a problem. Perfect. Everyone was here. No need to make multiple trips. I walked over to the coffee table, the one that Serena had insisted we buy from some boutique furniture store because apparently normal furniture stores weren't good enough, and cleared off the collection of champagne glasses and abandoned appetizers with more force than necessary. A few glasses clinked together dangerously, and Serena made a noise of protest, but I ignored her. Then I set down the folder. It was thick. Months of documentation don't fit in a slim folder, and it made a satisfying thunk when it hit the table, like a judge's gavel opening court. The folder was plain manila, which somehow made it more intimidating than if I'd chosen something fancy. This was serious business, not a presentation. "What's that?" Serena asked, and I could hear the wariness creeping into her voice now. She'd been married to me long enough to recognize when something was about to happen, even if she couldn't quite figure out what yet. "This," I said, opening the folder and spreading out the contents like I was dealing cards in the world's worst poker game, "is everything. Photos, audio transcripts, bank statements, text messages, video stills. A comprehensive collection of exactly how you and your sisters have treated my mother over the past several months." I laid them out methodically, creating a visual timeline of cruelty. Photos of Mom looking increasingly withdrawn and unhappy. Transcripts of conversations where they mocked her behind her back. Bank statements showing exactly how much their small gatherings had cost. Text messages where they discussed how to handle the old lady situation, like she was a pest control problem rather than a human being. Serena's face had gone pale, which was impressive considering how much makeup she was wearing. "You've been recording us?" Her voice was high and tight, equal parts outraged and panicked. "That's illegal." "Actually, it's not," I said calmly, and I'd checked this extensively with Naomi because I wasn't about to screw this up on a technicality. "This is my house. I'm allowed to record what happens in my own property, especially when I have reasonable suspicion that abuse is occurring." Which, as you can see from the evidence, I did. Tanya had stopped drinking her mimosa and was staring at the photos like they were written in a foreign language. "This is insane," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was looking at a transcript of a conversation where she'd suggested that Mom accidentally tripped down the stairs as a way to solve the problem, which she'd clearly meant as a joke, but which looked significantly less funny when written down and presented as evidence. "What's insane?" Brooke appeared at the top of the stairs, looking like she'd just woken up, which she probably had. Her hair was doing things that defied both gravity and explanation, and she was wearing one of my t-shirts, which I noted with irritation because I'd been looking for that shirt for weeks. "Why does everyone look so serious?" "Come down here," I said, and something in my voice made her comply immediately, descending the stairs with the kind of careful precision that suggested she was still slightly drunk or possibly just beginning to realize that this was not going to be a fun morning. I waited until she was standing there with her sisters, all three of them clustered together like they could somehow form a protective barrier against reality. Then I pulled out my phone, the one that had been recording their conversations for weeks, the one they'd walked past 1,000 times without ever suspecting. "I'm going to play something for you," I said, scrolling to one of the particularly damning recordings. "And I want you to listen very carefully." I pressed play, and Brooke's voice filled the room, tinny but clear through the phone's speaker. "She's taking up space. Like, I get that she's his mom and whatever, but it's awkward having her around all the time." Then Tanya's voice, agreeing enthusiastically. Then laughter, their laughter at my mother's expense. I watched their faces change color in real time, like watching a traffic light malfunction. Brooke went red, then white, then a kind of grayish color that suggested either shame or nausea, possibly both. Tanya's face had frozen into an expression of horror that would have been funny if this weren't so serious. Serena just stared at the phone like it was a bomb that might explode at any moment. The recording kept playing. More conversations, more mockery, more casual cruelty delivered with the kind of thoughtless ease that made it somehow worse than if it had been deliberate. They'd hurt my mother without even trying, without even thinking about it, just as a natural byproduct of existing in the same space as someone they considered beneath them. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, could hear someone's phone buzzing with a notification, could hear Tanya's breath coming fast and shallow like she was trying not to hyperventilate. "You can't do this," Serena said finally, and her voice had shifted from outrage to desperate. "This is our home. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," I interrupted, and I pulled out another set of papers from the folder, the ones that Naomi had prepared with such meticulous care. "Because as of 2 weeks ago, this house was transferred into a trust for my mother, specifically. Her name is on everything that matters now. The deed, the mortgage, all of it. Your names." I made a show of looking at the papers. "Not on anything. Not anymore." The words landed like physical blows. I watched comprehension dawn on their faces, watched them realize that this wasn't just about hurt feelings or marital problems. This was about cold, hard legal reality. They'd been playing house with someone else's property, and now the bill had come due. "That's not possible," Tanya said, but she sounded uncertain now. like she was trying to convince herself rather than me. You can't just change ownership of a house without. Without what? Without permission from people who don't own it. I smiled, and it probably wasn't a nice smile. I absolutely can. I did. It's done. Right on cue. And honestly, Naomi's timing was impeccable. There was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Naomi standing there with Jerry, her paralegal, who looked exactly as advertised. Former Marine, built like he could bench press a car, wearing a suit that somehow made him look even more intimidating. He had a briefcase that was definitely just for show because we'd already handled all the paperwork, but the visual effect was exactly what we needed. Ladies, Naomi said pleasantly, stepping into the room with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the law was entirely on your side. I'm Naomi Richardson, property attorney. This is Jerry. We're here to facilitate a smooth transition of possession. She said it so politely, like she was offering them tea instead of eviction. Jerry set the briefcase down on the coffee table, right on top of the evidence I'd laid out, and opened it to reveal more papers, more documents, more proof that this wasn't a bluff or an emotional outburst, but a carefully planned legal action. Naomi had a way of explaining legal documents that made you feel like you were being educated rather than destroyed, which was a valuable skill in her profession and particularly useful in this specific situation where three women were actively realizing their entire world was collapsing. She laid out the papers with the precision of a surgeon, each document representing another nail in the coffin of their comfortable delusion that this house, this life, belonged to them in any meaningful way. As you can see here, she said, pointing to a highlighted section with the kind of calm that comes from delivering bad news professionally for a living. The property was refinanced and transferred into an irrevocable trust on November 3rd. The beneficiary is Ruth Pemberton, with her son as trustee. The mortgage has been restructured, all equity redistributed, and all previous claims to the property have been legally dissolved. She spoke in that particular lawyer language that sounded almost friendly but was actually devastating, like someone explaining how a bomb worked while it was actively exploding. Jerry stood behind her, silent and imposing, his presence a physical reminder that this wasn't a negotiation or a discussion. This was a done deal being politely explained to people who no longer had any say in the matter. "This is insane," Brooke said, and her voice had gone up about an octave, sliding into that register that suggested she was about to either cry or start breaking things, possibly both. "You can't just kick us out. Serena lives here. This is her home." "Actually," Naomi said, and I noticed how she managed to make that word sound both polite and absolutely final. "This is Ruth Pemberton's home. Serena has been residing here as a guest of the property owner, a status which can be revoked at any time with proper notice. Which brings us to this." She slid another document across the table, this one with an official-looking header that screamed legal consequences. "What's that?" Serena's voice was barely a whisper now. All her earlier confidence evaporated like water on a hot sidewalk. She was staring at the document like it might bite her, which in a metaphorical sense, it absolutely would. "Eviction notice," Naomi said simply. 30 days is standard, but given the documented harassment and the hostile living environment created for the property owner, we're exercising the option for immediate removal. You have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings and vacate the premises. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. I could see the exact moment the words registered, could watch the comprehension spread across their faces like spilled ink on paper. 30 minutes. Not 30 days, not a week to figure things out, but 30 actual minutes to pack up and get out. 30 minutes? Tanya's voice cracked on the words. "That's not even legal. You can't do that. There are laws about this kind of thing, tenant rights, procedures." "There are indeed laws." Jerry spoke for the first time, and his voice was surprisingly gentle for someone who looked like he could break concrete with his bare hands. "And we followed every single one of them. You're not tenants. You never signed a lease, never paid rent, never had any legal standing as residents. You're guests who've overstayed your welcome, and the property owner has the right to ask you to leave immediately." "I'm his wife," Serena said, and there was desperation in her voice now. That particular kind of panic that comes from realizing that the identity you'd built your entire life around suddenly doesn't carry the weight you thought it did. You can't evict your own wife. I'd been quiet through most of this, letting Naomi handle the legal explanations because that's what I was paying her for, and because she was significantly better at remaining calm and professional than I was in this moment. But now I stepped forward, and I looked at Serena with all the accumulated hurt and anger and disappointment of the past several months. I can't evict my wife, I agreed, and I watched hope flicker across her face for just a second before I continued. But I can enforce the property rights of my mother, who owns this house, and who you've been systematically abusing while pretending to be family. And honestly, Serena, after everything I've seen and heard these past months, the word wife is starting to feel more like a legal technicality than an actual description of what we are to each other. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. I wasn't done. You locked my mother out of her own home last night while you threw a party. You and your sisters have spent months making her feel unwelcome, mocking her, pushing her around, treating her like she was an inconvenience instead of a person. And you did it all while smiling to my face and pretending everything was fine. We didn't mean, Brooke started, but I cut her off. You did mean it. That's the thing. You absolutely meant it. Maybe you didn't think about it. Maybe it just came naturally to you. But you meant every word, every shove, every dismissive comment. And now there are consequences. I checked my watch with deliberate slowness. 28 minutes now. I'd suggest you start packing. What followed was chaos of the most satisfying variety. Serena's wailing filled the house, a sound somewhere between genuine distress and performative outrage, the kind of crying that's designed to make you feel guilty, except I'd apparently used up my entire supply of guilt over the past few months and had none left to give. You can't do this, she kept repeating, like maybe if she said it enough times reality would rearrange itself to accommodate her preferences. Tanya went straight into denial mode, pulling out her phone and frantically calling someone. Probably her own lawyer, though I suspected that conversation was going to be short and unsatisfying when they confirmed that yes, actually, I could do exactly this. She paced around the living room like a caged animal, her expensive athleisure outfit suddenly looking less fashionable and more like the costume of someone who'd fundamentally misunderstood their own situation. Brooke just stood there for a minute, looking genuinely shocked, before something in her face hardened and she ran upstairs to start grabbing things. I could hear her opening drawers and slamming them closed, hear the sounds of hasty packing that suggested she was finally taking this seriously. They shoved jewelry into purses, jewelry I'd probably paid for at some point, though I couldn't prove it and honestly didn't care enough to try. They grabbed clothes and shoes and whatever else they deemed essential for their immediate survival outside of the house they'd taken for granted. They cursed at me, at each other, at the universe in general, with the kind of creative profanity that suggested they'd been holding back on their vocabulary choices for months and were now letting it all out at once. The soundtrack was spectacular. Doors slamming, people shouting, someone, I think it was Tanya, actually throwing something that shattered, which I made a mental note to document for potential property damage claims. It was like watching a bad reality show, except this was my actual life, and I was simultaneously the producer, the audience, and somehow the villain, even though I was pretty sure I was actually the hero of this particular story. I stood by the window and watched it all with what I can only describe as stunned satisfaction. That particular cocktail of emotions where you feel bad about feeling good about something bad happening to people who probably deserved it, but maybe not quite this dramatically. When they finally left. 32 minutes later, because Serena needed those extra 2 minutes to deliver a dramatic monologue about betrayal that would have been more effective if she hadn't been holding a designer handbag stuffed with my probably expensive throw pillows, the house breathed. Literally breathed, like it had been holding its breath for months and could finally exhale. The silence that settled in after the door slammed for the final time wasn't empty or sad. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels like relief. I stood in the wreckage of the living room for a minute, surrounded by abandoned champagne glasses and wilted flowers, and felt absolutely nothing except maybe tired. The dramatic confrontation I'd been building toward for weeks was over, and instead of feeling triumphant or vindicated, I mostly just wanted a nap and maybe a sandwich. Mom arrived an hour later in a taxi I'd arranged, and when she walked through the door, she stopped completely, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter her own house. Her hands were shaking slightly when I pressed the keys into them, the physical weight of ownership settling into her palm. This is your home now, I said, and I meant it in every legal and emotional sense. Completely yours. No conditions, no strings, no one to tell you where you can sit or what stories you're allowed to tell. She looked at the keys like they were sacred relics, turning them over in her fingers with the kind of reverence usually reserved for important documents or family heirlooms. Then she laughed, actually laughed, a sound that was half joy and half disbelief. And then she cried, tears running down her face while she smiled, emotions mixing together in that messy, complicated way that feelings do when you've been holding them in for too long. I don't know what to say, she whispered, and I hugged her because words weren't really necessary at that moment. Life didn't magically fix itself overnight like some kind of fairy tale where everything gets resolved in the final scene. The house still needed work. There were scuffs on the walls from hurried packing, a broken vase in the hallway that I'd need to clean up, that ridiculous floral wall that would require professional removal. The garden had been neglected and looked like it was staging a rebellion against organized plant life. But slowly, steadily, things patched themselves together. Mom started cooking again, real meals that filled the house with actual food smells instead of whatever expensive candle scent Serena had been obsessed with. She reclaimed her chair, her space, her right to exist without apologizing for it. Ava started coming over more. That's a whole other complicated story involving custody arrangements and difficult conversations. But when she did come, she'd curl up with her grandmother and listen to those stories about Pennsylvania coal country that she'd missed. Serena called 6 times in as many days, her voicemails evolving from angry to apologetic to desperate and finally to resigned. Each message was basically a script, some version of "I'm sorry," or "we need to talk," or "this isn't fair," and I let every single one go to voicemail. I'd listen to them once, file them away with the rest of my evidence collection, and then delete them from my phone if not from the cloud storage where everything lived permanently. Sometimes you collect voicemails like museum pieces, interesting artifacts from a previous era of your life, worth preserving for documentation purposes, but not worth responding to or putting on display in your actual living room. They existed in their own separate space, proof that it all really happened, but no longer relevant to the present moment. In the end, I didn't just reclaim a house with its mortgage and its scuffed walls and its garden full of rebellious plants. I reclaimed something bigger. Decency, self-respect, the basic principle that family means something more than shared DNA or legal documents. And I learned things that seemed obvious in hindsight but apparently needed to be learned through experience. Never underestimate your mother's capacity for resilience or her appetite for properly brewed tea. And never mistake silence for weakness just because someone chooses patience over immediate confrontation. Also, and this is a small tip for any future in-laws who might be reading this as some kind of cautionary tale. If you're going to throw a party in someone else's house, at least have the basic decency to vacuum afterward. And maybe, just maybe, consider whether the person whose name is on the mortgage might have opinions about champagne towers in their living room.